So I was riding along yesterday and my rear derailleur stopped working. The front derailleur worked, so I knew it wasn't the battery, and I could kick the derailleur over with my heel to make it shift. So we know that normally a derailleur, so this is a R8050, you shouldn't be able to move it. It's locked in place. It's not like a mechanical derailleur where you can move the cage by hand. So can't move it. On my broken one, you could move it. So I was able to kick it with my heel to make it shift. And then it would shift back to the small sprocket. So I got home and I assumed it was not repairable. But I was not able to find any videos showing what is inside of the motor. So this one is the working one. So we know that there is a motor in here, and that motor turns this silver thing which moves the cage. So this is a 6870 that's also broken. Motor makes this thing turn, which makes the parallelogram move. So problem is that there are 3 screws that are some kind of tri-wing that it's not common. I don't have the bit for that, so I got my Dremel with the little cutting wheel and I cut slots in the screws so that I could take the screws out with a slotted screwdriver. So again, this is the working derailleur. You can see there's a screw here, there's a circlip here, and 2 more tri-wing screws. So motor was mounted, I don't remember, something, I don't even know now. But I cut slots in the screw heads and took the motor off. Motor, whatever. It's more than just a motor. But you can see here's where the E-tube plugs in. Here's the thing that turns that moves the cage. So obviously this thing is sealed very well to be waterproof, and I also used the Dremel to cut open the motor. So this is just a plastic cover that I cut off, and I had to cut all the way around with the cutting wheel because it's fused plastic. Here is tiny wire connected to the circuit board, which is in turn connected to the servo motor right here. And so the problem actually was that there are 2 screws holding the motor to a little bracket. Wonder if I can zoom in. Yes. So taking this apart here, so you can see this thing that turns, that moves the cage, has partial gear. Here are reduction gears. Here's the servo motor. It has a worm gear. You can see a worm gear that turns that little gear, and that gear turns another gear, which turns another gear, which turns this partial gear, which makes the cage move. So the problem is that these two little Phillips screws came loose, so the worm gear was not engaging this gear. When the screws came out, it allowed the motor to shift away, and it was no longer, the teeth are no longer engaging this. It would just make unhappy motor noises when I tried to shift. So, if you ever have a problem when you're riding along and your rear derailleur doesn't shift, and crash mode, if you try to turn crash mode off and you find, well, you can't turn it off because it's not on to start with, and you go to your derailleur and you try moving it and find that you are able to move it. So normally you cannot move it. Can't really tell that I'm trying to move the cage in against the spring tension, but this silver piece is normally locked in place because of the worm gear. If you find that you're able to push your derailleur cage over with your fingers, it does want to spring back because it has a small spring. If you find that you can do that with your di2 rear derailleur, it's very possible you had the same problem that I did, where tiny screws came out, and unfortunately, since this is a fused together plastic case, you can't put it back together. But for some reason, I was not able to find anyone else who took one of these things apart. So if you're curious what's inside, that is a very long-winded description and video showing what's inside of the motor pod case, whatever you call this thing. So yeah, that's all.